2015 is what I would call sort of a stepping stone year, much more so than the last. While most of 2014 was filled with lackluster AAA releases that broke most of their promises, and almost all of what looked good ended up being pushed into this year, 2015 in a sense redeemed some of that. Not all of it certainly, but it was definitely a step in the right direction. Now, I don't want to jump the gun and say 2016 will definitely be better, but it looks like the industry is making strides to improve, and the best of what we didn't get this year will almost certainly see the light of day in the next. Again, this is merely speculation, but as of right now, this is what I could best describe 2015 as. Unfortunately, 2015, while not so much marred with poor business decisions and absolutely dreadful launch disasters as the previous year, it is a year that certainly suffered from the rampant beast known as the hype train, specifically with major releases such as Fallout 4 and Star Wars Battlefront. Despite that, we've seen plenty of good, and I would personally like to pay my own, effectively useless and really arbitrary, respects to the best of what the gaming industry in 2015 had to offer. However, I'm going to do things a bit differently from the norm. Instead of providing equal shares of attention to the 20 games I have in mind to talk about, I will instead only do that for the first 15, more than likely summarizing them to an even lesser degree. But, for the top 5, I would like to give extra credit where it is due, which is why you will not see much if any mention of these titles in this video. They will get their own, which I will upload soon after, possibly later in the day or even sometime the next. Really, it's all up to me, and I am a power-hungry tyrant with hardly 1900 subscribers and a handful of viewers to show for it. As for my opinions, they probably mean even less, but these wouldn't be my videos without them, so expect to hear my stances with open ear and mind. If you agree, disagree, or are generally just happy to partake in another's point of view, or simply want to take pity on me, don't be afraid to click that like button. If me talking about video games on the internet, like so many others before me have done, upsets you or even infuriates you, then please feel free to do the same with the thumbs down icon instead. For what was a relatively lackluster year for Nintendo's console, the nice thing about it is that all of its best titles stood out from the norm. Even the closest to its roots, Super Mario Maker, while certainly a bit lazy in design, being just a prettied up version of Nintendo's actual level design tool, is still a great game. Making levels from your favorite generation of 2D plumber platforming is something I can safely say almost everyone has wanted to do at some point. While the novelty of this kind of game can certainly vary drastically from person to person because, let's be frank, what you see here is really all you get, if it does rope you in, you can expect dozens to even hundreds of hours combing the wide variety of horrible community-made levels in search of those truly spectacular hidden gems. After so many years of consumers complaining about being screwed over by publishers for money-grabbing season passes, timed releases, and awful pre-order schemes, a game like Dying Light would be celebrated as a breath of fresh air. But, as it seems, even making an above-average game alongside your consumer-friendly tactics doesn't always mean you'll reap the benefits. Don't get me wrong, it isn't the perfect example, but with regular updates and a good chunk of free DLC gracing this first-person parkour survival game, it really should stand out more. Most people overlooked it as just another zombie game, and in a lot of ways it is, which is probably why it isn't considered by most as one of the best games of the year. But hey, it does Mirror's Edge better than Mirror's Edge, and the multiplayer is actually pretty dang sweet. When Rocksteady announced the last entry in the highly acclaimed Arkham series, people were pretty stoked, naturally. And when the game came out, it wasn't necessarily the best in the series, but definitely right up there with Arkham Asylum and Arkham City, two of the best games from the last generation. At least on console. If it weren't for the absolutely horrendous debacle that surrounded the PC release of this game, it might be in talks for Game of the Year, but the disastrous state of the game on PC that it was and is still in after numerous patches, re-releases, and so on hold it back enough that it can't be ignored. Remember Assassin's Creed Unity? It pales in comparison to this train wreck. Not to mention this one definitely has the weakest story. Not necessarily bad, but it's not as good as the first two. As is becoming increasingly standard with the Assassin's Creed series, people have sort of stopped caring now, haven't they? It was pretty much expected that Syndicate wouldn't get much attention after the disaster that was Unity, and while of course it got enough, because it is Assassin's Creed, in the end it was really overlooked for the most part. Which is a shame really, because this is probably the best in the series apart from Black Flag. It definitely has a lot of the same tired concepts and mechanics that the other titles have, with hardly the optional content of the fourth Assassin's Creed, but they're refined to a higher standard than the others. If this were someone's first game in the series, I think they would be a little confused as to why everyone complains about the franchise so much. But, as a wise monkey once said, the past certainly can hurt. The best first-person walking simulator ever released. Everybody's Gone to the Rapture is a great mystery game with striking visuals and a compelling story, and that's really all there is to say about it. Not much else in the way of positives or negatives, aside from the fact that you may need to look up online how to actually move faster than a slow walking speed throughout the game. So if you're into that kind of thing, I'd say go for it. Simple as that. Despite persistent issues on PC, fighters have both for better and for worse always had more of a home on consoles. And this game runs pretty darn well there. In fact, the game could easily be considered the definitive Mortal Kombat experience. It looks amazing, handles amazing. The elements that make Mortal Kombat what it is are handled so bone-chillingly well, even to the point where it will probably make you sick. It's a pretty solid experience in a year where consoles hardly saw much of anything in the way of fighters. Another solid entry in the ever-popular Halo series, despite, for the most part, missing its typical chief component. See what I did there? Halo 5 is good. Although, for die-hard fans, I would have to say it sports the weakest campaign in the series, if only by a small margin. But it does have the best multiplayer, including the well-implemented Warzone mode. Maybe still not up to the standards of the first 3 Halo games, but it's still a worthy successor nonetheless, and if you have an Xbox One, you'd be a fool not to pick it up. Another fantastic game, somewhat hurt by its poor PC performance, although not nearly to the extent of Batman. It also received a lot of backlash for going back on its promise for a Wii U release. But looking at it now, I know it will anger some people, but with a game that looks this good, sorry Wii U fans, your console just isn't strong enough. For the racing fans, in terms of track-based, its only real competition was Forza Motorsport 6 this year, and I'll be honest in saying that in every way, except maybe graphical fidelity, Project Cars exceeds it. Tighter controls, a more realized campaign mode, and its multi-platform, which alone gives it an edge in the consumer space. If you like driving pretty cars, I'd say give this a look. An homage to slasher flicks much like The Grudge and Shudder, spectacularly realized in video game format. This game follows the mishappenings of a bunch of terrible and unlikable teenagers in a dark and eerie situation, and it is up to you by the choices you make to save them, or not, because they really are despicable. Thankfully, it is one of those few choose-your-own-adventure games where your choices actually do matter, and they aren't just dialogue that pads out the story for the sake of gameplay until you reach the inevitable outcome. It's a lot of fun, it looks pretty, and in a sick and twisted way, it is kind of fun watching a bunch of horrible people get axed off in various ways, especially because most of these characters we all know or knew growing up. That being said, it's not so much scary as it is silly and only sometimes creepy, but take it for what you will. I know a lot of people outside the core Pokemon fanbase will disagree with me here, especially considering the lack of appeal the Mystery Dungeon series has had for casuals since its roots on the Game Boy Advance. But I think this latest entry is as definitive of an experience as it gets, and the new graphical style that we've seen since Pokemon fully realized itself on the 3DS really serves to enhance it even further. Most of the criticism levied on this title went toward its campaign, while praise was directed at the endgame, which is a bit ironic because in previous entries it was actually quite the opposite. At least on GBA and DS. In this instance, I can't say I would agree. Sure, the dialogue and plot is unbelievably corny at times, but no more or less so than any other Pokemon game, so it's fine. And yes, this game definitely sports the best post-game content. For all of that and more, I would rather not spoil. I'm certainly willing to call this the best 3DS game of 2015. After fans of the legendary SimCity franchise were let down in a spectacular way early last year, it was nice to see another series rise to the challenge and usurp the throne, as it were, and it was Colossal Order who did that with Cities Skylines. This game is as perfect as simulators get in a day and age where simply the term simulator is nothing more than a joke. It certainly does have flaws, but none of them go above nitpick status. The UI is more user-friendly, and it's as satisfying as ever watching something you poured so many mouse clicks into grow before your very eyes. Why is it that if a Yoshi game isn't Yoshi's Island, it gets panned for simply being too easy? Heck, even the Yoshi's Island remake got panned. Okay, maybe panned is too strong a word for Yoshi's Woolly World, but am I the only one who thinks this is arguably the best game on the Wii U? And yes, it can be difficult as a matter of fact, ball-bustingly so. What's nice is, like most Yoshi games, it's up to the player how much they want to challenge themselves based on what they're willing to go out of their way for. Isn't that a good thing? Also, Yarn Yoshi is absolutely adorable. Seriously. Even with my anti-amiibo political stance, I have one sitting on my desk, and proudly at that. This game is great, and if you have a Wii U, put it to good use again and buy this game. In a lot of ways, Fallout 4 is a bad game. If you don't like town building, odd mishaps, weapon crafting, moderate level exploration, or simply just shooting things, then it's probably not the game for you. However, if you do like those things or simply like screwing around and you aren't very technically minded, this is a fantastic game. I'll admit this game is only this high on the list because yes, I've had a lot of fun with it. Probably more than any other game you'll see in this first video, at the very least. It's definitely not all it was cracked up to be, but really, no Bethesda game is. They're always buggy and messy at launch, and no, that should not be encouraged. But, for most people, it's still a lot of nonsensical fun, which comes right down to the core element of what games should be, even if all of the reasons it is fun weren't necessarily intended by the developers. It's definitely hard for me to put this game above Woolly World on the list, because subjectively, I enjoyed it more than Splatoon by a considerable amount. But that being said, Splatoon is exactly what Nintendo fans have been waiting years for, and is also exactly what the Wii U needed to stay alive. A fresh, new IP with a good or even great online experience. Sure, it was a little bare bones at launch, but it's a fun game regardless, and it's taken a lot of the monotony we've come to expect out of Nintendo's first-party titles. It's a lovely breath of fresh air, with solid gameplay mechanics and an interface that just about anyone can pick up on and learn almost instantly, and can also appeal to casual and even hardcore players to an extent. Now that's a rarity, especially from Nintendo. A great game, a great developer behind it, and while it certainly takes a bit of work to get into, with The Witcher, it's absolutely worth it. A much more refined open-world RPG as opposed to Dragon Age Inquisition or the Elder Scrolls series, it's packed with hundreds of hours of content, dozens of hours of more free DLC, beautiful visuals, great music, and a fun story. What's not to love? Well, a few things, such as the choppy dialogue and fair amount of glitches that have pretty much become par for the course with any open-world game these days, although to its credit, it probably has the least of any of its competitors. The third entry in the Witcher franchise is a very good game, and while I wouldn't call it the best thing this year, and certainly not for everyone, it's definitely solid, to say the least. So that's 15 games, all very good, and I think it's only fair that I flash up a few more good 2015 releases on screen that stand among the others, but either I didn't think they were better than these, or I either couldn't find anything to talk about, or simply had little to no experience with but have heard great things. But, in the next one, I'll be getting into the best of the best. If you paid any attention this year, you can probably figure them out by process of elimination. But for now, I'll see you all in the next one.